intention behind the universe, the purpose behind it.
Sure.
Why physical things exist at all. If there was no purpose behind it, there could be nothing that should or shouldn't be done.
There's some rabbit holes in philosophy that may or may not have a real basis in reality, except the fact that they exist in our brains, which is a conundrum all by itself, that really are tough to come up with any real answers on. And for me, that one is kind of one of those.
All right, but we have to ask, what are we referring to when we say that something is wrong in a moral sense? We're saying that it shouldn't be done. That's not the way that things should be.
Sure, there's a subjectivity.
It's prescriptive.
There's a level of opinion when it comes to, is this thing right, is this thing wrong? Now, there's a few things in common law, and I define common law as laws that through all cultures and all communities have had some level of cohesivity. There's a level of agreement that humans just tend to say, killing your neighbor without an agreed upon reason is a no-no. Stealing their stuff.
Universal societal laws.
Yeah. Those kinds of things have a level of agreement that people just don't like it. For whatever reasons and unjustifications and blah, 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 blah.
Then there's times where that societal law is, pretty absurd to follow. You're either a good conformist or non-conformist.
Absurd is also one of those kind of not very clear terms. And let me throw something that might be a little more clear.
All right.
Okay.
I can give you
there
an
are
example.
stable systems,
Yeah.
right, of rule sets, and there are unstable systems of rule sets. If you have two identical computers and you put two different operating systems on it, kernel and all, and one gives you lots of it don't work. Error messages just won't turn on, randomly pops up with a pop-up that says fuck you, whatever, right? Unstable, chaotic, doesn't work. Another one, whatever functionality the user wants to use on that system seems to work nice and smooth every time, all the time, under lots of different forms of iterations over lots and lots of copies of that computer with that system with lots of users using it all at the same time, and it still works. You have stable and unstable. Legal systems have been working on that experiment as long as all the way back to the Hammurabi stone.
Right.
Okay, there's systems that result in a society showing large amounts of satisfaction with those rules, large levels of agreement, also large amounts of dissatisfaction and lots of disagreement. You have systems that show a lot of tolerance to changes in politics and changes in technology. You look at the Constitution, arguably it's a very stable system because we can change it, but there's some factors like freedom of speech and the rights of the individual over the whole of the nation. Each one of us has rights under the Constitution that supplant everyone else's right to attempt to subjugate that right upon us. We have the right of free speech. We have the right of representation. We have other rights. Not to get into everything and all the details. But that's one of the factors that makes that rule set stable.
But whether a rule set, say a moral system, causes society to function well or not, whether it works, so to speak, I don't believe is a rational grounds for determining whether it is objectively true.
Well, you'd have to define what objectively true actually means, which you can't under that format.
It would be true whether anybody knew about it or not.
Sure, and that just gets in. It's the same thing as when folks find out that I'm really interested in expanding human life and other life from Earth into the deep cosmology, and they get into what's my opinion on alien life? And I have to tell them that's an unanswerable question. I can't have an honest opinion on that. The closest thing I can get is the popularized algebraic formula, which is super easy. It's just a whole strew of variables that nobody has any solid answers on. And there's a whole bunch of false narrative, misleading, trollish material on whether some flying saucer came down to Earth and that represents alien life, or was it some misbegotten experiment by some rocket guys. Who knows? I don't. So it's all a quash. I would rather, focus on the things that I have a more solid, verifiable understanding of, and then we can act upon. I'm not afraid of entertaining it, but there's a limit to how far you can go with it.
What would you be willing to say is the truth?
That, again, is a good question. Let's take a look at al-haq, and how I explain it to people is al gives the maximum ultimate quality to the root word. The root word being haq, which is simple truth. I have a green plastic bottle with some H2O in it. That is a normative truth. It's just an everyday kind of truth. But the whole and absolute and complete truth is a bullseye we can intend to aim for, but we may never fully understand. In fact, we probably never will get very close at all.
For we all know in part.
There's some things that we can look at and with a lot of agreement with others say that appears to be true. It appears to be true that gravity is a real function in our cosmology. It's not necessarily true that we really understand exactly how it works.
I believe you can know the truth regardless of whether you can prove the truth.
There's a statement in the Quran where it says, they will say, we are guided by our hearts. Okay, if you're guided by your heart on that, I'm going to leave you with that.
My point is that
but there's really nothing I can do with that.
My point is that the opposite position is self-refuting. If I say you can know the truth and someone else says no you can't, I would say how do you know that's true?
And that's just circular anyway.
No,
it's another thing.
No, it's not
that
circular.
it's certainly a valuable statement, but it's not something that I can comment on in any sincerity.
It's not circular.
Would it then be for you impossible to know the truth, the full truth?
There is more to know about God, and this is kind of a statement that I get from the Saudis when I visited with them, and it's kind of a common representation of the attitude about knowledge, is that there's more to know about God than anyone can ever know. And the comparison is if you take a needle and you dip it in the ocean, you pull it out, there's a speck of water far smaller than what we would call a drop. And you compare that to 7 times all the waters of the world and more. That's the amount of knowledge that all mankind can ever know about God.
You come up with that formula, and how can you know that that's accurate?
I'm not saying it is, but it is an interesting comparison when you consider that there's a fair amount of support that there's more information than any given person can know. For instance, you yourself, if you were born and transferred into the Library of Congress and taught to read at the earliest level, and every attempt was made to make it so that you had the speed reading training, and other people brought your books to you, and all of these kinds of things, you would never, and skip all the duplicate material, you would never even reasonably scratch the surface of what that one set of libraries, which is one library, but it's multiple buildings, unless you count the underground structure. By the way, anybody ever gets a chance to get a reader's card at the Library of Congress, super recommend it. It's open to the American public. It's very cool.
Yeah,
it's nice. Very nicely decorated.
Even though you say
sweet
it's
people.
Possible to scratch the surface of knowledge, I'd say it's impossible for the mind of the flesh to know the things of the spirit.
I'm just going to leave that one with you. I'm not going to mess with that. I have no comment on that.
Are you familiar with the laws of thought, also known as like laws of logic?
that title is not particularly familiar to me, because I don't really have so much of a formalized academic background, as I've spent a whole lot of my time studying, and a whole lot of my time I have been denied company. I've spent a lot of my life, in fact I did 16 contracts over 12 years, most of the time doing 16 to 18 hours a day with no days off for months at a time. And the entire time, instead of becoming a zombie like a lot of other guys appeared to do, I studied everything within and without. I studied the behavior of my coworkers. I studied the architecture of the buildings. I digested everything I could in order to keep my mind active, because I couldn't conceive of the opposite. And I've been that way since I was a little kid. In fact, for some strange reason, my mom used to bring technicians, civilian technicians from the military base just to talk to me. And I'm not trying to toot a horn or any of that kind of thing. It's one of the conundrums in my life. Why did they do that? And the one guy that did show up at the house was definitely not military. He was definitely civilian. And his only interest was, what did I think of Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time? I was 10. And it's a very readable book. I think, those little library boxes around the schools and stuff, I think a really good guerrilla intelligence would be to take copies of books like that and slip them in there along with the little kids' coloring books. You might get some smart kids out of it.